Well, hi, I'm John Salvatore, and welcome to Faith Church's online message. You probably have heard of Corrie ten Boom. Both she and her family were Dutch Christians who risked their own lives during World War II to hide Jews from the Nazis in a secret room in their home. And when they were discovered, Corrie and her sister Betsy were placed in a prison camp along with the Jews they had tried to protect. The women were crammed into dirty, cold, damp barracks, and food consisted of nothing more than watery turnip soup. And during those days, they were forced to do extremely hard labor. And despite their dreadful circumstances, Corrie and Betsy did not stop trusting in God. Betsy found it particularly difficult because she was not well. She was suffering from a vitamin deficiency, from which she needed vitamin drops. And Corrie and Betsy had managed to bring some of their things with them to the first prison camp, including vitamin drops and their Bible. However, when they moved to a second camp, they were not allowed to take anything with them. And each woman was searched thoroughly as they passed through the line into the gate. And all Corrie and Betsy could do was to pray desperately to their Heavenly Father. And Corrie stood in line trying to hide behind her back a jumper with vitamin drops and a Bible wrapped inside. And when it was Corrie's turn to pass the guard, instead of searching her, he just pushed her through the gate with the words, "Move along, you're holding up the line." And so Corrie and Betsy arrived inside the barracks, bringing not only their Bible and their vitamins, but the knowledge of God's power to work a miracle. Now, soon Corrie discovered that there were 25 other women with the same vitamin deficiency in the camp. And they too needed those precious vitamin drops that she was able to smuggle in. "What should I do, Lord?" asked Corrie. "If I give the drops to all those women, there won't be enough to last a day. Even if I save the drops for Betsy, there will only be enough to last a month." Corrie knew what she had to do. She lined up all the women who were ill, and she gave them the drops. And strangely enough, she lined the women up again the next day, and there was still enough drops for everyone. She tried it again the next day and the next, and still there were enough. Every time she tilted the bottle, a drop appeared at the tip of the glass stopper. "It just couldn't be," said Corrie. She held it up to the light, trying to see how much was left, but the dark brown glass was too thick to see through. "Don't try and explain it," said Corrie to Betsy. "Just accept it as a surprise from a Father who loves you." Then one day a young woman also in the prison camp came to Corrie. "Look what I got for you," she said, "vitamins." Somehow she had stolen them from the staff room. And there were several huge containers of vitamins and yeast compound. "Well, first finish the drops," said Corrie. But that night, no matter how long she held the bottle upside down or how hard she shook it, not another drop appeared. Here's a line that I borrowed from Stephen Cole that expresses the big idea behind today's sermon. Christ uses inadequate people like Corrie ten Boom or any one of us who surrender what little they have to Him to meet the overwhelming needs of others. Today we're in John chapter 6 in our series through the Gospel of John. And this chapter divides easily in 3 sections. There's Jesus who feeds the 5,000 in verses 1 through 15. And then Jesus walks across the Sea of Galilee in verses 16 through 24. And finally, Jesus declares himself the bread of life in verses 25 through 71. Now, these 3 events form a single narrative. The chapter begins with Jesus miraculously feeding the crowd bread from heaven, and then Jesus uses the feeding as an object lesson later in the chapter to declare himself to be the bread of life. And I considered preaching the entire chapter, all 71 verses, in a single sermon, but I reconsidered. because there is a message within the message that I want to explore with you today. And that message is found in the feeding of the 5,000. So let's read it as a single unit, and then we'll come back and unpack it a piece at a time. John chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him, because they saw the signs that he performed by healing the sick. And then Jesus went up on a mountainside, and he sat down with his disciples. And the Jewish Passover festival was near. And when Jesus looked up and he saw a great multitude coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" And Jesus only asked this to test them, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have but a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. And Jesus then took the loaves, he gave thanks, and he distributed those to those who were seated as much as they wanted, and he did the same with the fish. And when they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that you have left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them up, and they filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. It may interest you to know that the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle recorded in all 4 Gospels. It most certainly left a lasting impression on the disciples. Notice again how John starts out. Sometime after this, that is, after Jesus had finished clashing with the religious officials in Jerusalem, that he crossed to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. John adds the Roman designation here for his non-Jewish readers. Now, Mark in his gospel lets us know that Jesus and his disciples had crossed the lake in an attempt to get away from the demands of the crowd. Mark chapter 6, verse 31. You see, for days they had served the people, healing the sick and proclaiming the good news of the gospel, and it was time to get away to a secluded place for some much-needed rest and relaxation. Now, Luke informs us that Jesus took his disciples somewhere in the wilderness east of Bethsaida. But try as they did, they could not escape the crowds. Now, note verse 2. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs that he had performed by healing the sick. I think anyone in ministry, or any person who has a people-centered job, or even a mother of children, especially small children, understands how very difficult and yet necessary it is to periodically just get away. Get away from the needs of people, to recharge and to regroup. This 15-second video, I think, says it all. Take a look.
Dad's out shoveling the driveway. Mom desperately needed a treat to get through the rest of the night. So I'm hiding in the pantry, eating a treat. Is that wrong? They don't ever go away. They want everything you have. See? She's always there.
Hi. Hi.
Hi.
Verse 3. Jesus went up on the mountainside, and he sat down with his disciples. And they watched as the people kept coming by the thousands. John tells us that there were 5,000 men, which means if you add the women and children, you could conservatively estimate about 20,000 people who arrived to see Jesus. 20,000 people who have needs. And the disciples suggest to Jesus, send these people away, according to Mark chapter 6. They saw the people as a bother, as an unwelcome interruption to their plans. And rather than hide in the pantry like that young mother, the disciples perhaps hid behind a mountainside bush, hoping that the people would simply go away. But Jesus viewed people differently. Anne Graham Lutz, who commentating on this passage, writes this: Jesus saw people who had rowed 3 miles across the lake, or had walked 7 miles around it, carrying their sick just to see Jesus. He saw people as more important than his own plans and his need to rest. He saw people not as an interruption, but as an opportunity to reveal his loving care and his Father's compassionate power to meet their deepest needs. He saw people as sheep who needed a shepherd. He saw people the way God saw people. Friends, how do you see people? Especially those who interrupt your free time, who break into your life unexpectedly. Do you see your coworker as someone who just simply talks too much, or the neighbor kids as just a nuisance? Are your elderly parents too needy? Friends, would you ask God to help you to see people through his eyes? If we're ever going to meet the needs of others, we must not view people as an annoying interruption in our lives. We must see them as divine opportunities to display God's love. One of my common prayers in our staff meeting is to ask the Lord to interrupt our self-made plans for the week with at least one unexpected divine interruption. Jesus knew the people were hungry from a long day of travel. It was evening, according to Matthew's account. It would soon be dark, and there was no Taco Bell or In-N-Out Burger on the corner. There was no time to travel the nearest town to find any food. And so we read in verse 5, when Jesus looked up and he saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" It makes sense that Jesus would ask Philip where to purchase bread for the crowd because he was from that area. He perhaps had some local knowledge. Prior to the question, I don't think it even occurred to Philip or any of the disciples that they had any responsibility at all to help or to care for these people. Verse 6, John tells us that he asked this only to test him, that is to test Philip, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Did you know that Jesus regularly tests his disciples? He tested them then, and he tests us now. He regularly places us in situations to see if we will respond by faith to our circumstances or by sight. So Philip takes out his calculator. He starts crunching numbers and likely answers Jesus in a voice of exasperation. Verse 7, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have but a bite. Philip's like, you got to be kidding me, Lord. Do you see all these mouths to feed? Do you realize how much teenagers alone would eat? What's a half a year's wage by our standards? In America, the national average wage index is $54,000 in 2019. That means a half a year's wages would be $27,000 worth of bread to give everyone but a bite. Oh, the situation looked hopeless. And sadly, our response to the Lord's testing is too often the same as Philip's. When faced with a problem, we look to financial spreadsheets to determine what is and what is not possible. Andrew goes through a little more trouble to solve the food dilemma. He starts to take inventory of available assets, verse 8. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. There's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? But even Andrew acknowledges that the meager resources they have are inadequate. The disciples feel that what is being asked of them by Jesus is beyond them. The need simply cannot be met. Everything about the disciples' words convey inadequacy. My friends, do we approach the life or ministry problems Jesus asks us to address any different? When faced with seemingly impossible tasks, how often do we measure the need, assess our inadequate resources, and resign in hopelessness? Remember, Jesus was testing his disciples, and they failed. So perhaps we can learn from their failure and not fail ourselves. What Philip and Andrew did not see is that impossible situations are not solved by what we have in our bank accounts or in our resource inventories. Impossibilities are solved by Jesus. The disciples needed to turn to him. Jesus will often ask us to do things that we are inadequate to accomplish, so that our inadequacy will drive us to turn in faith to his all-sufficiency. Bible teacher William Lane used to say that followers of Jesus should always work at a level of their own incompetency. We shouldn't be satisfied simply doing the things we're good at. We should strive to be right on the edge so that if the Lord doesn't show up to help us, we will fail miserably. This, my friends, is the place where the disciples are right now. They're on the edge. If Jesus doesn't show up and act, they fail miserably. So notice what happens next, verse 10. Jesus says, "Have the people sit down. There's plenty of grass in the place." And they sat down. About 5,000 men were there, and of course women and children. Imagine the scene. Mark and Luke's gospel inform us that the disciples organized the people in groups of hundreds and fifties and instructed them to prepare for a meal. At this point, no one has seen any food. And the disciples have absolutely no idea how the people will be fed. And yet, in response to the Lord's command, they simply act in faith. Verse 11. Jesus then took the loaves, he gave thanks, and he distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. Jesus gives thanks. And like Corrie ten Boom's liquid vitamin bottle, the baskets of bread and fish multiplied until everyone had what they needed. The offering had been meager, but the miracle was dramatic, and the provision was abundant. But the lesson was not over yet. Verse 12. Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them, and they filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over for those who had eaten. Each of the disciples were instructed to take a basket called a kophinos, typically used to carry one person's provision for a journey of 2 to 3 days. And they collected enough uneaten leftovers to place in those baskets for their provision for the coming days. And at the end of the day, the disciples' lesson should have been clear. In their own strength, they were not adequate for the task. They never were, nor will they ever be. But Andrew, without realizing it, had found the key to the storehouse of God's ample supply. When he and the boy offered to Jesus a few loaves and fishes, they were offering to Jesus all that they had. And what they had in the Master's hands was more than enough. What do you have? Do you have a little bit of Bible knowledge? A little bit of money? A little bit of faith? Don't focus on what you lack. Focus on what you have, and then give it to Jesus. Give it to Jesus, what little you have, to put to use in kingdom ministry. Jesus calls us to commit whatever we have, even if it's no more than a sack lunch, He calls, come. Come to me with all that you have. And then he offers the promise. You take care of the addition, and I'll take charge of the multiplication. And the mission I've invited you to join me in will be accomplished in my name. Dear friends, remember our big idea for today's message? Christ uses inadequate people, people like you and me, who surrender what little we have to him to meet the overwhelming needs of others. Sometimes life can be a demoralizing struggle. Some challenges loom larger than our meager resources can meet. Some demands far outweigh our ability to meet them. And some problems are too complex for us to solve. Let's face it, the world is big and we are small. And to make matters worse, we naturally are predisposed to think only on a horizontal plane. But nothing is impossible for God. Yet we habitually think in terms of what we have to offer and what can be accomplished through our own natural means and resources. The size of a challenge should never be gauged in terms of our own capacity, because what we have to offer will never be enough. Know this: if Jesus calls you to a task, he will supply what you need. I think of Hudson Taylor, a great man of faith, whose missionary efforts helped open inland China to the gospel. And time again, he saw God do amazing things in the face of hopeless circumstances and murderous hostility against him. And reflecting on his own experience, he made this remark. He said, there are 3 stages in any work. 3 stages in any work attempted for God: impossible, difficult, and done. Dear friends, when you are stuck in the impossible stage of life, cheer up, because your impossibility may simply be stage 1. Stage 1 of a mighty miracle God desires to perform on your behalf. Let me end with a prayer. Those of you at home, if you wouldn't mind bowing your heads and closing your eyes. I want you to take a moment, just in the quietness of your heart, just between you and the Holy Spirit. I want you to think about what it is you would like to do for the Lord. What it is that you would like to do for the Lord if time wasn't an issue, if money or resources were not an issue. Is there anything that God has put on your heart to do for him, but you've been fearful of doing it because you simply do not feel adequate? Now think about what little you do have. Think about what you have to help make this dream a reality. And I want you now, in your mind's eye, I want you to offer it to Jesus. And will you say with me these words in the quietness of your own heart? Jesus, help me to see that I don't need an adequate bank account like Philip. I don't need abundant assets like Andrew hinted at. But like the little boy with a small lunch, all I need is to place what little I have in your hands. No matter how meager my time, my talents, my treasure, I place it all in your hands. Lord, give me the faith to believe that you can bless them and multiply them like fish and loaves for your glory and for the good of those who are helped through them. Amen.